focused on me?
Sure is.
Okay. So far we've been talking about one particular branch of Buddhism known as Theravada. It's not that what I've said doesn't apply to the other forms of Buddhism, the Mahayana and the Vajrayana, but in fact, this is kind of the basis for all forms of Buddhism. But the Theravada has remained strictly adherent to the Tipitaka, this Pali canon of Buddhist scriptures, and has resisted attempts or these other schools of Buddhism, their movements to expand on the Buddhist teaching. And of course, when we talk about the Mahayana, they'll claim that they're not expanding, they're just bringing up aspects of the Buddhist teachings that folks weren't prepared for, and for the first, several hundred years. But they have access to the Buddha's more advanced teachings. But from the Theravada perspective, no, they've just kind of added to the Buddha's teachings. And so the Theravada Buddhists want to remain strictly adherent to Buddha's teachings as preserved in the Pali canon or the Tipitaka. So we're gonna kind of wrap up talking about Theravada Buddhism. In fact, the guest speaker that we'll have on January 12th, which is a friend of mine who is an American who has converted to Buddhism and is a Buddhist practitioner, lay practitioner. He'll come and speak, and he comes more out of this Mahayana Vajrayana tradition rather than the Theravada. And so he even sent me a message the other day. He says, I've been enjoying listening to your kind of very detailed explication of the Theravada tradition. It's good because they're not going to get Theravada from me, they're going to get Mahayana and Vajrayana from me. So we'll start on that next week. I'll give you some kind of background on the Mahayana and the Vajrayana, but then my friend Josh will be the one who will really kind of get into that when he comes to speak. But I do want to wrap up with Theravada. And I should also say, when I was telling you of the life, I wasn't just drawing on the Theravada traditions of the Pali canon or the Tipitaka, which you can find in this book here, The Life of the Buddha. I was also drawing from time to time on some Mahayana traditions about the life of the Buddha, just because they add some fun elements to the story. But we're going to focus in on Theravada because it's important for us to kind of get a sense of Theravada, which is, I think, numbers-wise, and I should have these numbers at my fingertips, but I don't. But I think numbers-wise is pretty small. I think there are far more Mahayana Buddhists than Theravada Buddhists, but don't quote me on that because I don't have the numbers at my fingertips. Theravada means the tradition or the teaching or the school of the elders. As the story goes, after the death or nibbana of the Buddha, his Sangha met together for what is now called the First Buddhist Council. And it's during this time that they recited all of his Dhamma, all of his teachings, as well as the Patimokkha, the rules for the Sangha, for the bhikkhus and bhikkhunis, the monastics. And principally, his disciple Ananda typically was the one did the recitation. Ananda apparently had a spectacular memory and was always at the Buddha's side, and so he would. So much of the Tipitaka begins with, from Ananda's perspective, saying, "On this occasion, I heard the Blessed One say such and such." What I want to say about this before we move on is that I haven't spent a whole lot of time talking about the divisions in the Tipitaka and the content necessarily of each of the different parts of the Tipitaka or the Buddhist scriptures, which don't get written down until over 300 years after this First Buddhist Council. So that like the Vedas before them and other important texts of Hinduism that were first passed down orally generation to generation, the Buddhist scriptures were passed down orally generation to generation before ever getting written down. There's not. The reason why I haven't focused on the Tipitaka is because they don't carry the weight of scripture the way that the Quran does for Muslims, or the Bible does for Christians, or even the Vedas do for Hindus. I mean, Buddha said before his parinibbana, he said, as his disciples were grieved by his impending death, he said, "I am my Dhamma. Wherever the Dhamma is, there I am. Wherever it's taught." And so the point of the Dhamma written down is not for you to be focused on the words. It's not that there's some God who's revealing himself in the words of the Tipitaka. These are the teachings for how to be Buddhist and how to seek enlightenment, how to seek nibbana. And the point is, once you're on that path and you know it, the actual texts aren't as important. And so there's actually a great deal of emphasis on having a teacher in Buddhism. So, I went to one of the two Theravada Buddhist monks around here that I met, and the first, and I asked the first one, well, how do I learn meditation? I've got these books, because I'm an academic kind of guy. I've got these books. I've read these books, what these books say about it. And he says, no, you can't learn meditation from a book. You have to have a teacher. So then I went to the other Buddhist monk and asked him the same question. He gave me a book. He gave me this little book right here. But in the book, it has a section where it says, this book can get you started, but you really need to go find a teacher. Right? Because it's not, the words themselves are only meant to get you to the practice, in a sense. The Dhamma, the truth that's revealed in the Dhamma is something that can only really be known through practice. And practice you have to have a teacher for. So I'm not a teacher of Buddhism, and so you don't know the true Dhamma because I've just been telling you stuff that I've read in books. But that's why I haven't focused as much on the Tipitaka, how it's broken up and what each section is and that kind of thing, because it's just not important in the way that, for example, we would think that it's very important to know the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and to understand the Gospels and the words of Jesus and this kind of thing, because these are, for us, revelation. This is how we know God. God has revealed himself in this way. Same for Muslims. The Quran is the revelation of Allah. This is, if you want to know the truth, if you want to know Allah, this is his eternal word given to you. That's not the case with the Tipitaka. And even with the Vedas in Hinduism, you remember, this is the underlying, these are the underlying hymns of all of reality. So you want to, if you are of the right caste, you want to be able to study and know and memorize the Vedas. It's just not true for the Tipitaka. I mean, clearly Buddhist monks spend a lot of time and effort in learning and memorizing these teachings in the Tipitaka, but it just doesn't have that same kind of meaning as these other types of scriptures. So that's why we haven't focused on that. As you might imagine, if this tradition is being passed down orally generation after generation, there might arise some debates over what was said and how it was said, and debates or divisions over what's more important, and are there new things that need to be added to the scriptures or to the teachings of the Buddha. And so, beginning really with the Second Buddhist Council, which took place 70 years after the Buddha's reaching of Parinibbana, or his death, the Sangha began to split into various Nikayas, or schools, that had different interpretations of his teachings. But eventually, all of these other Nikayas died out, and the one early or ancient tradition that continued, because each of these Nikayas was in their own way a continuation of the same tradition, going back to the Buddha himself, but the one that continued on and is present is Theravada. And so let's take a moment from that history and just talk about the Sangha, talk about the way the Sangha works in Theravada Buddhism. Much more so than in Mahayana and Vajrayana. If you really want to be a Buddhist, you have to become a bhikkhu or a bhikkhuni. This is the name for Buddhist monks and nuns. It means a mendicant or a beggar, because they live off of the alms that they collect. There's plenty for a Buddhist layperson who's not a bhikkhu to do. There's the 5 precepts to live by. They too can meditate. They can go on retreat and learn from the bhikkhus. So it's not as if there's nothing for the Buddhist layperson to do. There's plenty for the Buddhist layperson to do in Theravada tradition. But the Buddhist layperson is not going to reach Nibbana. It's not available to them because they're not going to have the opportunity to put in the time, effort required for in meditation and mind cultivation for reaching Nibbana. So what you can do is you can kind of there's plenty, like I said, for the layperson to do that will move them along the path, but in this life they're not going to reach Nibbana. And one of the things for them to do is to build what's called building merit by, for example, giving to the bhikkhus. If a bhikkhu shows up at your door with their begging bowl and you give them food, or you support the bhikkhu, the monastery, support the place where they live. All of this adds merit to you, or what we might call, good karma or good kama. That's for the layperson, but the real emphasis is on the bhikkhus and the bhikkhunis, the monks and the nuns. Now we haven't said a whole lot about bhikkhunis, so I want to take a second and talk about the Buddhist nun. When Buddha first started teaching the Dhamma, he collected around himself a group of men who would be his bhikkhus. The Sangha was originally all men. But on a visit back to his home of Kapilavastu, his aunt Prajapati, and if you remember, his mother, Buddha's mother, died not long after his. And so he was raised by his aunt, who was another one of his father's wives. He was raised, so his aunt is also kind of like his foster mother, the real mother, the mother that he knew growing up, Prajapati. She came to him and said, I want to take the vows, I want to become a member of the Sangha. Well, at first the Buddha said, no, this is a boys only club. So apparently reaching enlightenment doesn't necessarily get you over patriarchy. But at first he said no. But then she persisted, and she appealed to him, and she went to Ananda, and she said, Ananda, please help me, I don't see, Basically, she and Ananda asked the Buddha, is there anything about a woman that would keep a woman from being able to realize Nirvana? And the Buddha said, no. And she said, then why won't you let me join the Sangha? And so he was convinced, and Prajapati and several other women became the first of the bhikkhuni. Interestingly enough, though, as time went on, sometime between the 11th and 13th centuries, and AD, or in the Common Era, all of the bhikkhunis kind of fizzled out. I don't know why. I don't know if anyone knows for sure why, but the order of nuns kind of dissipated and went away. So that in the 20th century, for most of the 20th century, there were no Theravada Buddhist nuns. There wasn't a bhikkhuni. But in the mid-90s, I think maybe 1996, there was a movement to restore the order of the bhikkhuni. And I believe those 11 women were brought in. Part of the problem was, once there were no more, you need other bhikkhunis present for a new bhikkhuni to be ordained. And so once there were no more, they didn't have anyone to be there to ordain new ones. But I'm not entirely sure how they got around that, but they got around that in the 90s. Though I don't know if that's universally accepted in Theravada Buddhism, this new order of bhikkhuni. But after that time, many women did still take vows. They took the vows that you might take at a retreat, or if you were a novitiate. And they lived essentially lives of Buddhist nuns. They just weren't technically Theravada Buddhist nuns. And in some ways that actually made things probably better for them, because Buddhist nuns are always under the oversight of a Buddhist monk. But when they weren't technically nuns, they didn't have to be under the oversight of a male monk. So I don't know, but apparently they have restored it. How are we doing on time, Bev? 9:44. 9:45. Okay, we're not too bad. The other thing that I want to say about the Sangha, because we actually have already talked a lot about the Sangha and what they do, and you watch those videos, and both of the videos that I showed you were videos of, of Theravada Sangha, a Theravada Bhikkhu. So you got to see what their daily life is actually like and what it means for them to be in this tradition. One thing I'm not sure that they mentioned in those videos, and I think we need to mention now, and this will be the last thing we say about it, is that the highest ideal for in Theravada Buddhism is to become an arahant, and you can only become an arahant if you're a bhikkhu or a bhikkhuni. And an arahant is essentially someone who has reached enlightenment in this life and will go on to or achieve Pari Nibbana. Remember, that's Nibbana, or blowing out without remainder when they die. They won't be reborn again. That's the highest ideal. So in a sense, you might see it's sometimes translated, Arahant is a Buddhist saint. It's important to emphasize that that's not the highest ideal in Mahayana Buddhism, as we'll see. The highest ideal in Mahayana Buddhism is the Bodhisattva, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. So to wrap up our talk on Theravada Buddhism, remember all of this is mostly happening in India at this time. Right? For those first few hundred years, Buddhism was really a religion, if we're going to use that word, of India. And that's where it had started, that's where it had taken hold. And it really reached its height under the rule of the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka, or Asok, different ways of pronouncing it. Ashoka was the grandson of Chandragupta Maurya, and Chandragupta Maurya had created, he was the first one to establish the Mauryan Empire and the Mauryan dynasty. And what's important about this is the Mauryan Empire was the closest to full Indian, a rule over the full subcontinent of India that there would be, I think, until the British. So for the most part, India is a collection of different kingdoms, and that's going to be the case before the Mauryan Empire and after the Mauryan Empire until the British Empire. But for this time, starting with Chandragupta Maurya, you had something close to a full Indian empire. But what's interesting is Chandragupta, at some point, felt that he had done the wrong thing. He repented of his life. He became a Jain or a Jain, follower of the teachings of the Mahavira, and renounced the throne. And he eventually did what is what all Jains hope to do as a way to die. He starved himself to death as a way of he fasted to death as a way of giving up all violence towards any creature, including towards animals and plants. So his son succeeded him. His son was Bindusara, and eventually Bindusara was succeeded by his son Ashoka, and Ashoka reigned from around 269 BC to around 232 BC. Ashoka really expanded the empire to its largest that it ever got. He's still known and considered a great emperor by Indians, so even though eventually he becomes a Buddhist and India is not a Buddhist country, he's still held up as a great kind of example of a great king and emperor. But at some point during, I think it's maybe his 7th or 8th year of his reign, there was a kingdom, the Kalinga kingdom was fighting back, trying to maintain their own sovereignty. He led a military campaign against the Kalinga Empire, or the Kalinga kingdom, to absorb it into the Mauryan Empire. It was a bloody battle. He massacred people. It was terrible. And afterwards, Ashoka said, we don't know what his religious affiliation was at this point, if he had any. But Ashoka said, he repented of the evil he had done and all that he had killed and he converted to Buddhism. And so in some ways, Ashoka is spoken of like the Buddhist Constantine. Constantine converted to, or at least made Christianity legal in the Roman Empire, and then eventually on his deathbed was baptized and converted. And that made all the difference for Christianity in terms of Christianity then became the imperial religion in the decades following Constantine, and so much of our history has been shaped by that. Well, the same with Buddhism. Ashoka becomes Buddhist. He doesn't force his empire to become Buddhist, just like Constantine didn't force his empire to become Christian, but he does try and convert people to Buddhism. So he sends out Buddhist missionaries. I think his own son becomes a Buddhist missionary to Sri Lanka. He sends Buddhist missionaries to China, right? So further east. So this is how Buddhism gets to China originally. He sends them west, so that we know he sends Buddhist missionaries as far west as the Roman Empire and as Egypt. He is sending out missionaries. He's trying to convince his empire to become Buddhist. He becomes Buddhist. He becomes a vegetarian. He tries to convince his, I don't think he was very successful about this, but he tries to convince his empire to become vegetarian. He really represents the height of Buddhist influence in India. And it's after his reign. Buddhism persists in India after his reign, and is supported by some rulers of for example, the Gupta dynasties, but eventually it fades out in India, so that there's, I think, less than 1% of the population in India is Buddhist. So Buddhism has made its way to other places. But I'm trying to remember. There was one last thing I was going to tell you about Ashoka, but I can't remember it. I think the time's up, basically. Right? Yeah. So we got to wrap up now. If I think of it, I'll tell you next week. But next week we're going to get into the Mahayana and the Vajrayana tradition.